we've got good news. Just spoke with Speaker McCarthy, and we've reached a bipartisan budget agreement that we're ready to move to the full Congress. And I think it's a really important step forward, and it takes the threat of catastrophic default off the table, protects our hard-earned and historic economic recovery, and the agreement also represents a compromise, which means no one got everything they want. But that's the responsibility of governing. And this is a deal that's good news, I believe you'll see, for the American people. The agreement prevents the worst possible crisis, a default for the first time in our nation's history. An economic recession, retirement accounts devastated, millions of jobs lost. It also protects key priorities and accomplishments and values that congressional Democrats and I have fought long and hard for. Investing in America's agenda that's creating good jobs and communities throughout the country. It protects Social Security, Medicare, and veterans, and so much more. The Speaker and I made it clear from the start that the only way forward was a bipartisan agreement. That agreement now goes to the United States House and to the Senate. I strongly urge both chambers to pass that agreement. Let's keep moving forward on meeting our obligations and building the strongest economy in the history of the world. I'll take a few questions.
President, you said at the beginning that the debt ceiling was not negotiable. Isn't that what you've just done here? And isn't that what
You guys, look, we're not negotiating the debt ceiling. Here's the deal. They passed the debt ceiling, and they said they'd only do it on condition that it have all these cuts in it. I said, I'm not going to do that. You pass the debt ceiling, period. I'll negotiate with you on the cuts, what you say, what's going to happen, what the budget's going to look like. That's what we are negotiating in order to get to them deciding that they're going to go along with a new debt ceiling, meaning that it's not attached. It's something totally different attached than was attached before. So if you want to try to make it look like I made some compromise in the debt ceiling, I didn't. I made a compromise on the budget.
That's what they wanted, is you to make a compromise on the budget, and that's what you've done, even though you haven't gone as far as they wanted. Isn't that right?
Sure, yeah. Well, can you think of an alternative?
Mr. President, what do you say to members of your own party who say you've made too many concessions in this deal?
They'll find I didn't.
Mr. President, on your allies and adversaries to America, would you be willing to say about what you think this process said to those adversaries and allies? You have a deal now, but what does the process say? What does the struggle say to them?
Well, it says we've been through this more than once, and it's just the nature of the way we handle the deficit and handle whether we're going to, each year, going to pay our debts. And it's happened more than once. It will probably happen again, but it's not going to happen at least for another 2 years here. And I don't think beyond that it won't either.
Mr. President, do you think it's time for the U.S. to get rid of the debt limit? That this is, for the reasons you just laid out?
No, I think it would cause more controversy getting rid of the debt limit, although I am exploring the idea that we would, at a later date, a year or two from now, decide whether or not the 14th Amendment, how that actually would impact on whether or not you need to do the debt limit every year. But that's another day. Thank you.
Mr. President, do you believe Speaker McCarthy has the vote, and did he negotiate in good faith?
I think he negotiated with me in good faith. He kept his word. He said what he would do. He did what he said he'd do. And I have no idea whether he had the votes. I expect he does. I don't think he would have made the agreement.
Mr. President, do you have a comment on the elections in Turkey? Have you spoken with President Erdogan?
I have not spoken with him yet.
Do you wish
You have a comment?
Some of your Democratic colleagues are saying that this policy will lead some people to go hungry. What is your response to that?
It's ridiculous assertion.
Do you wish you had started these negotiations sooner?
No, it would have made any difference.
Mr. President, is financial aid for Ukraine secured in your new budget?
Okay, there you have President Biden speaking to reporters just a few moments ago. He was saying essentially there that he believes that the House Speaker Kevin McCarthy was negotiating in good faith during this process. At one point, I think he was sparring with Peter Baker of the New York Times a bit there and said, well, what's the alternative when it comes to negotiating or not negotiating over the debt ceiling? And let me go to you, Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz, since I interrupted you, although I did warn you in advance that that might happen. Your response to what the
No problem.
president had, exactly, your response to what the president had to say there, because he was reminded of the fact that he did say he didn't want to negotiate over the debt ceiling, and then he had to negotiate over the debt ceiling. That's when he said, well, what's the alternative there? It sounds as though the president, the White House, Democrats really just didn't have a choice here. You had to negotiate over the debt ceiling.
Well, I was pleased that right from the beginning of the discussions, they took whether or not we were going to raise the debt ceiling and crash our economy off the table. Both sides agreed we're not going to do that. And then, Jim, as a longtime member of the Appropriations Committee, I can tell you this is the time of year when we are negotiating the appropriations top lines anyway. Essentially, we did that, more at the beginning of the process through these negotiations. And that's what we talked about on our caucus call just now. We probably would have not wanted to get as much in the weeds in terms of the framework at this point in the game, but we had a lot at stake, and it's really critical. We had Republicans who were willing to crash our economy into the side of a cliff, who were willing to not pay our bills. By the way, on a deficit that they ran up themselves, they have a $1.3 trillion unpaid bill of tax cuts that they wouldn't touch, mostly that went to millionaires and wealthy people. And that was off limits in those discussions, which is outrageous. When you have tax cuts, you're pulling revenue out of the economy, and that counts just as much as spending. And the Republicans under Donald Trump didn't pay for any of that. So they took that off the table. We were operating in a situation where we had to protect veterans funding, which they were willing to cut. We had to make sure that we were going to have the kind of funding needs that were not draconian from the cuts that they proposed. We ended up at FY23 levels. The Republicans are trying to spin it as FY22, but I know the details, and I know the granularity of it. At the end of the day, when we go through the appropriations process, we'll be at FY23 levels. And by the way, we're protecting and ensuring that we don't go through this again in next year.
A quick follow-up on what the president had to say, Congresswoman. Right there at the very end, he indicated that maybe not before the 2024 election, maybe it's after the 2024 election. It sounds like he's going to be revisiting the idea of the 14th Amendment and whether or not the president can essentially raise the debt ceiling himself or herself by virtue of the 14th Amendment. Did you pick up on that when he said that? And what are your thoughts? Is it time for the United States to have a system where you don't have to go through the Congress to raise the debt ceiling? It sounds like the president said that would be too disruptive right now, but it sounds like he is receptive to that idea perhaps down the road. What did you make of that?
Well, I personally have always thought we should take off the table whether or not we pay our bills that our debts that our nation has incurred. There's no family in America that has the ability to not pay their bills. They can't just decide not to do that, and neither can we. And that shouldn't be subject to the political whims or the hostage-taking ability of one side or the other. In this case, the Republicans are always the ones that are repeatedly willing to do that and hold a gun to the head of the nation's economy. I do think we should take that off the table, although I heard the president say that it wouldn't be responsible. And I thought he meant it wouldn't be responsible to eliminate the debt ceiling. So I'm not really clear. I wasn't quite clear what he was saying, but I know he wasn't wanting to go through the 14th Amendment with the potential for judicial challenges now, and perhaps he would revisit that down the road. But at the end of the day, we have to pay our bills. We shouldn't be going through this.
Yeah, we can't have a default. That would be catastrophic. And Eva McKend, since you're right here in the studio with me, your thoughts on what the president had to say. What stood out to you? He said that he believes the House Speaker Kevin McCarthy is negotiating in good faith. That may not sit well with a lot of McCarthy's very conservative Republican colleagues who wish that McCarthy had gotten more out of this.
But this is always who President Biden has been. He is always a creature of the Senate. He's always been this pragmatic lawmaker, moderate, willing to work with Republicans. You know, when I saw him come out, I thought this makes it all the more hard for Republicans to argue that he is beholden to the left. Clearly, he is not, if he is willing to make these compromises. But it was a reversal, to be clear, Jim. He said all along, I have argued that the only way forward is a bipartisan agreement. He has not said that all along. That is incorrect. He initially said that this was non-negotiable. Well, he negotiated. And he long said that there should be no compromise when it comes to the debt ceiling, that this is obligatory, that this is the responsibility of Congress. So ultimately, he did have to compromise, but I don't know how much of a political liability it is for him, because it robs Republicans of a talking point that he is totally dictated by progressives in the left flank.